Hello, so I'm going to talk to you today about protection of species in habitats. So lesson objectives then, we'll be looking at how different organisations work together, how they cooperate in order to conserve species. And as part of that, we'll look at CITES and the CBD and things like that. And we'll also look at environmental impact assessments, so EIAs, and the importance of EIAs. So there are a few examples, cooperation examples. We've got CITES that we'll have a look at, Rio Convention on Diversity, zoos we'll talk a little bit about, but we did most of that last lesson, as well as the botanic gardens and seed banks, and local conservation groups, so things like this countryside stewardship scheme. So CITES then is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, wild fauna and flora. So fauna are the animals and flora are the plants. And you can see in this picture here, this is all kinds of products that have been made by various different animals that have been illegally traded. So they've got a really difficult job trying to set laws and enforce those laws. In fact, enforcing those laws is very, very difficult. So what they like to do is to make sure that international trade of wildlife doesn't actually threaten the survival of a particular species. And there are 25,000 species plus that are protected by CITES. So the main aims then of CITES then to regulate and monitor international trade, make sure that trade doesn't actually endanger the survival of populations, make sure that wild plants then prohibited for commercial purposes, so trade in wild plants, trade in propagated plants is allowed subject to a permit, ensures that less endangered species are traded with a permit and limits are applied to that. But as I said, really difficult to actually enforce these laws, because as long as there is a demand for a particular product, they're going to carry on supplying that demand. And a good example of that is the pangolin. So pangolin is the most trafficked animal in the world, and there are 8 species of pangolin, and all of those then are protected by these laws. There's just some data here saying that between 2011 and 2013, the seizures meant that they estimated that 116 to 234,000 had been killed for trafficking. But they think that that's just the tip of the iceberg, and that actually the trade of these pangolins is much more widespread. So the volume of pangolins then in the wildlife trade much higher than their estimates that they got based on seizures. So it's a real big problem. Really interesting documentary on the BBC about pangolins and protection of pangolins and things like that, which I would advise that you watch. It's really interesting, but sad. Then we've got the Convention of Biological Diversity, so CBD, and that was signed at the Rio Convention, so Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and that promotes sustainable development. So it encourages these partner companies to adopt ex situ conservation management that actually help the in situ conservation that's in place. So the aims of the CBD then, conservation of biological diversity is obviously their main aim. Sustainable use of the components of ecosystems, appropriate sharing of scientific knowledge and technologies, and genetic resources as well. So they'll share genetic resources between zoos and things like that in order to maximise the genetic diversity of particular populations. Fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. And obviously the zoos, botanical gardens, seed banks, those are all really important of this part of this. So CBD promotes sharing of technology and genetic material. So that's things like breeding programs. They'll have breeding programs to share that genetic material and maximise the genetic diversity. And they'll import things like sperm and eggs and embryos as well as part of that. With the botanical gardens, then they've got those seed collections, and those can be used in research. They can also be used for reintroduction programs and things like that. Now, in terms of the local conservation, there are various smaller organisations that are involved in that. So things like the Countryside Stewardship Scheme that will make sure that parts of the countryside are actually looked after, and they are working with local landowners to improve the beauty, the diversity and the habitats of particular landscape features, and promote public access to those so that we can actually benefit from that as well. And they'll encourage things like hedge laying, planting and dry stone walling in areas. So hedges are really, really important for insect diversity, because they'll promote lots of predators, which means that less pesticides need to be used on crops and things like that. So obviously that would be the preference, to have natural predators, so things like spiders and beetles, have those growing in the hedgerow, living in the hedgerow, instead of using pesticides. So that's what they're trying to encourage farmers to do, to use less pesticides and more of these hedges, which would be natural predators. And then there's the Environment Stewardship Scheme, which was founded in 2005. And again, very similar aims for that one. So looking after wildlife species, habitats, make sure that the land retains its original character, protects historic features and resources in that area, conserve traditional livestock, and countryside education as well. And if we look at the label here, you can see that actually there are lots of other symbols on here. So it just goes to show how important it is that all these different organisations work together. So we've got DEFRA there, Rural Development Service. So for any development that you have, if you're going to build on a piece of land, then you need to carry out what's called an environmental impact assessment, so an EIA. Really important to do that before any sort of development. And that makes sure that you don't get adverse effects on biological diversity. It limits the environmental consequences of a building project. They can notify the people that are working on a building project if there's any sort of grave changes that they might have, and arrange emergency responses if they need to. So these environmental impact assessments then, they're on a local level, and they work alongside the planning authority, local planning authority. And they'll look at the size of the developments that is being built. They'll look at the environmental sensitivity of the location and the type of impact that might be expected in that particular area. And there are various stages to this. So if you've got a development near you, I know we've got a big housing estate being built at the top of our road, which everyone was not quite so happy about, because we had lots and lots of hedgerows there, and there were lots of birds living in those hedgerows, and they covered those hedgerows. So they put like a fleece lining on the hedgerows to stop the birds from nesting. So this was done last year. Now it's obviously well underway these days. But before they did that project, they needed to do an environmental impact assessment and think about the impact of building on that particular piece of land. So it was a farmer's field before, it used to have cows in it. And they need to make sure that they limit that. So one thing that they are doing at that particular site is that they are replanting the hedgerows. So they did remove all the hedgerows along there, which is actually, I have seen a decrease in the number of birds that we've got in the area, which is a bit sad. But they have replanted those, and they've planted older saplings as well. So hopefully that will re-establish itself once the hedgerow has grown a little bit more. So that's quite good. Anyway, back to the environmental impact assessment. So the first thing that they need to do is that the developers complete a statement with an assessment of the biological diversity and looking at the impact on it and thinking about how they can actually limit that impact. The statement then gets published. Local authority then need to take that into account when they are deciding whether a development is allowed to take place in a particular area. Good, well, congratulations. This is the end of the Year 1 content. We'll be starting the Year 2 content next week. So on Tuesday, we start the ecosystems topic. You have got access, or should have access now, to the Year 2 Moodle site if you want to have a little look at what you're going to be looking at over the coming weeks. I'll be available on Teams or email if you want to contact me to find out any more about any of these things.